Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We've got quite the legal head scratcher today.
Oh, yeah.
You want to know if the Indian government can create subcategories within the scheduled castes
Right.
for stuff like reservations, and we've got some Supreme Court rulings to dig into.
Lots to unpack.
It's going to be fascinating, I think, to untangle all the history and legal arguments.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's just dive right in.
It's a really interesting debate, you know? It gets at the heart of how India is trying to create a more equal society.
Yeah.
Like, are we talking about addressing historical disadvantage fairly, or are we going to end up creating even more divisions?
Exactly.
That's a tough one.
So much to consider.
Yeah.
Even to just start wrapping our heads around this, we need to go back to the basics.
Okay.
The Indian Constitution.
Right.
I know Articles 14, 15, and 16 are like super important here, but can you remind me how they connect to this whole idea of affirmative action?
Sure. Yeah, those articles are really cute.
Yeah.
Article 14 guarantees everyone is equal under the law, while 15 specifically says no discrimination based on things like caste.
Right.
And then we have 16 that makes sure everyone has a fair chance at getting public employment.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's all about creating a level playing field in theory,
Right.
but we know the reality is that those historical inequalities, they still exist.
Yeah, they definitely do.
So that's where reservations come in.
Okay, so reservations are like a tool to sort of level the playing field.
Exactly. They're a form of affirmative action.
Okay.
Specifically designed to give a boost to groups who've been systematically disadvantaged,
Makes sense.
like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about the scheduled castes themselves for a second.
Okay.
It seems like their definition is really crucial to understanding this whole subcategory debate.
Yeah.
What I find really interesting is that the term scheduled castes isn't about one specific caste, right?
You got it.
It's like this whole collection of different groups all bundled together.
You've hit on a really important point. The term actually has its roots way back in colonial India,
Oh, wow.
in the 1935 Government of India Act.
Okay.
Back then, it was all about untouchability.
Right.
Groups facing serious social exclusion denied basic rights.
Yeah.
And that's the legacy the Indian Constitution inherited.
Wow. So we're not even dealing with a single group experiencing disadvantage,
Right.
but like a whole bunch of them lumped together under this scheduled caste label.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if everyone within that label faces the same level of disadvantage, though, right?
Exactly. And that takes us to the core of the legal battle we're looking at today.
Okay.
Can the government further divide the scheduled castes into subcategories for reservation purposes?
That's a big question.
It gets tricky because the 2005 E.V. Chennai case basically said no to that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing this E.V. Chennai case mentioned a lot in these rulings.
Yeah, it's a big one.
What was so important about
So it was like a line in the sand.
Okay.
The court said treating scheduled castes as one big group was necessary for their legal protection. Yeah. Like, subdividing them would go against that principle of equality before the law.
Article 14, right?
Exactly, Article 14. They were worried it could create new kinds of inequality instead of solving the old ones.
I see. So at first glance, it seems like a pretty clear no to subclassification.
Yeah, you could say that.
But I'm guessing it can't be that simple.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's always more to the story.
There have to be people arguing that this ignores some pretty harsh realities within the scheduled castes themselves.
Oh, absolutely. You're right on the money.
Okay, so tell me more.
The folks who support making subcategories argue that even within the scheduled castes,
Right.
there's this whole range of disadvantage.
Yeah.
Some groups are much worse off than others, and they're worried that without recognizing this, the benefits of reservation won't reach the people who need them most.
The most marginalized people.
Exactly.
It's almost like we're trying to fix a leaky boat,
Okay.
but we're not sure if we should patch it up as one whole thing or focus on the specific areas that are leaking the most.
That is a great analogy.
So where do we even begin to figure that out?
Well, this is where evidence becomes super important.
Okay.
If you're going to argue that some groups within the scheduled castes are way more disadvantaged,
Right.
you need hard data to back that up.
Okay, so show me the data. What are we talking about here?
There's some really powerful research that sheds light on this.
Okay.
For example, there was this study in 1989 by Navsarjan in Gujarat,
Okay.
and they found something pretty shocking.
What's that?
Discrimination was happening within Dalit communities.
What?
Things like denying food or water based on which specific Dalit caste you belong to.
Whoa.
Like, imagine one Dalit group practicing untouchability against another.
That's just awful.
Yeah.
It shows how deep these prejudices go.
Yeah, it really does.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Researchers like Ravichandran Bathran and Uma Ramaswamy
Okay.
have shown how literacy rates, income levels, all sorts of indicators of well-being, they vary a lot across different scheduled caste groups.
So it's a pretty strong argument against treating them all as one big homogeneous block.
Exactly.
Okay, so the data is showing us this really complex picture.
Yeah.
And it's challenging this idea that everyone within the scheduled caste is starting from the same place.
Right.
But how do we bring this back to the legal arguments? Is there any other court ruling that could help us figure out how to deal with this?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
The 1992 Indrasani case.
Indrasani.
Even though it was about the other backward classes,
Okay.
it gives us some useful principles to think about.
Got it.
In that case, the court was wrestling with this idea of a creamy layer.
Okay, creamy layer. I'm not sure I follow.
Well, imagine you have a cup of coffee,
Okay.
and over time, the cream rises to the top.
Right.
The creamy layer in this context refers to those within a disadvantaged group
Okay.
who have done well enough to be comparable to the forward classes.
Gotcha. So they've risen to the top, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
So is the thinking that if a segment of a backward class is doing just as well as those who were never disadvantaged in the first place,
Right.
maybe they don't need the same level of support anymore?
That's the core idea.
Okay.
And while Indrasani was about the OBCs,
Right.
not the scheduled caste,
Yeah.
the logic behind identifying and potentially excluding the most privileged segments within a designated backward class could apply here, too.
I see. So even though the groups are different, the principles for figuring out who actually needs the help could be similar.
Yeah, there are some parallels there.
But how do we even begin to apply that to the scheduled castes?
Right.
It seems so sensitive given their history.
It definitely wouldn't be an easy task.
Right.
To figure out if there's a creamy layer within the scheduled castes.
Yeah.
Would take a ton of careful consideration and a deep understanding of each group's specific struggles.
Right, because it can't just be about income or even education level, can it?
No, you're absolutely right.
We need a much broader understanding of social and economic well-being to figure that out.
Exactly. We'd have to look at things like representation in government jobs,
Okay.
land ownership, access to health care,
Yeah.
even the amount of violence or discrimination against specific scheduled caste groups.
Right. It's really about understanding how that historical disadvantage continues to impact people's lives today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how that past disadvantage still affects the present.
So it seems like we would need to come up with a whole new framework, one that goes beyond just simple economic indicators
Right.
and considers all the different ways that scheduled castes are disadvantaged.
Absolutely. A nuanced approach.
Yeah.
One that acknowledges that disadvantage isn't always obvious or easily measured.
Right.
We have to be careful not to create more inequality by ignoring the less obvious forms of exclusion.
You mentioned the need for solid data earlier.
Yes.
And it seems even more crucial now. We need reliable information to even start thinking about identifying a creamy layer
Right.
within the scheduled castes in a way that's fair and makes sense.
Absolutely. Data collection would be so important in this process.
Okay, so what kind of data are we talking about?
We'd need detailed information about the socioeconomic conditions of different scheduled caste groups.
Okay,
And it has to be broken down by things like geography,
gotcha.
occupation, even specific types of discrimination faced.
That's a lot of data.
It is, but it's crucial.
And it's not just about having the data.
Right.
It's about how you collect it and analyze it too, isn't it?
That is a very crucial point.
We don't want to end up with a system that's biased or insensitive to different communities.
You're absolutely right. The data collection process itself needs to be designed very carefully. It
Okay.
needs to be ethical, culturally sensitive,
Right.
and empowering for the people involved.
Yeah, because it's not just about taking information. It's about building trust and making sure that people most affected by these policies have a say.
That's what it's all about.
So let's imagine for a second that we have all this data
Okay.
and we've figured out a way to identify a creamy layer within the scheduled castes using a system that's fair and based on evidence.
Okay.
What happens next?
Well, that's when things get even more complicated.
Okay.
Deciding which subclassification model to use,
Right.
the preference model or the exclusive model.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be an easy choice. It would depend on a lot of different things.
Okay.
Like, what are the specific goals of the policy?
Right.
How big is the difference between different scheduled caste groups? And how could this impact social cohesion?
So many things to think about.
Yeah, it's a complex issue.
Okay, so walk me through it. What are some of the key things we need to consider when choosing between the preference model and the exclusive model?
Let's start with the preference model. Remember, this is like reserving a piece of the pie for a specific subgroup in the existing scheduled caste quota.
Yeah.
It's a more flexible approach.
Okay.
And it could be useful when you want to make sure multiple disadvantaged groups are represented without totally excluding any of them.
So if you have several scheduled caste groups who are all facing significant disadvantage, but to different degrees, the preference model could make sure each group gets some level of help.
Exactly. It's about making a system that responds to those differences in disadvantage within the scheduled castes.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are drawbacks to this approach too.
Oh, of course. There always are.
What are some of those?
Well, some folks argue that it might not be enough to truly address the needs of the most marginalized groups.
Right.
If the piece of the pie for a specific subgroup is too small, it might not actually change their lives that much.
I see. So it's a balancing act.
Exactly.
Between being inclusive and giving targeted support.
Sure.
What about the exclusive model? How does it approach these challenges?
The exclusive model is more targeted.
Okay.
It's like giving a separate piece of the pie altogether to a specific subgroup. This could be a good thing if a certain scheduled caste group is facing extreme disadvantage.
Makes sense.
And needs more focused help.
So if the data shows one particular group is consistently being left behind, the exclusive model could give them a dedicated way to access opportunities.
Exactly. It acknowledges that sometimes equal treatment doesn't lead to equal outcomes.
Right.
But of course, the exclusive model has its critics too.
Okay. What are they worried about?
Some people worry it could lead to resentment and division between scheduled caste groups.
Interesting.
Like if one group is seen as getting special treatment, it could create tension and go against that broader goal of social solidarity.
I see why there's no simple answer here.
It's a tough one, for sure.
Both models have their pros and cons.
Yeah.
And choosing between them would require a deep understanding of the specific situation.
Absolutely.
And thinking carefully about the potential consequences.
You've got it.
This is already so complex.
Yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore.
It's clear that subclassification isn't just a yes or no question.
Definitely not.
There are so many things to consider.
It's a multifaceted issue.
From the historical context and legal precedents to the ethical implications of how we define and categorize people.
Exactly. This isn't just a legal or academic exercise. It's about real people's lives.
Absolutely.
And their hopes for a fairer future.
Well said. And it seems like this creamy layer concept is going to be really important as we keep trying to untangle this puzzle.
It's a key piece of the puzzle, for sure.
But before we get into that, I think we need a minute to digest everything we've talked about so far.
Good idea. It's a lot to take in.
It's clear that subclassification isn't just about ticking boxes and filling quotas.
It's much more than that.
It's about navigating these complicated social dynamics and making sure that justice is truly served.
Well put.
Join us in part 2 as we delve deeper into these complexities.
Yes, we'll get into the nitty-gritty.
And explore how India might navigate this delicate balancing act.
Welcome back to our deep dive into subclassification within India's scheduled castes.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is.
Before we took a break, we were just starting to see how even the idea of a creamy layer within the scheduled castes raises some really tough questions.
It really does feel like we're walking a tightrope.
Yeah, it does. On the one hand, we want to make sure the most disadvantaged groups are getting the help they need.
Absolutely.
But on the other, we don't want to accidentally create new kinds of exclusion or make the existing tensions within the scheduled castes even worse.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a real dilemma.
So let's talk more about that creamy layer idea.
Okay.
The Indrasani case, even though it focused on the other backward classes. It gave us some clues about how to approach this.
It did.
But how do we apply that thinking to the scheduled castes in a way that's sensitive and fair?
It wouldn't be easy, that's for sure.
Right.
We can't just take the creamy layer idea and plop it down in the scheduled caste context. The scheduled castes have their own history.
Yeah, definitely.
And the discrimination they face is often very different from what other backward classes experience.
Untouchability has had such a long-lasting impact.
Exactly.
So if we're thinking about a creamy layer within the scheduled castes, it can't just be about income or even education.
Right.
We need to look at a much wider range of factors to understand social and economic well-being.
Absolutely. We'd have to consider things like representation in government jobs, land ownership, access to health care, even how much violence or discrimination different scheduled caste groups face.
It's about looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. Understanding how historical disadvantage is still shaping people's lives.
It seems like we'd need to create a whole new system.
Yeah, we might need a new framework.
One that goes beyond simple economic measures.
Right.
And takes into account all the different ways that scheduled castes are disadvantaged.
A more nuanced approach?
Exactly. One that recognizes that disadvantage isn't always easy to see or measure.
You're getting it.
We need to be so careful not to make inequality worse by overlooking those less obvious forms of exclusion.
That's a very important point.
And you mentioned the need for good data before.
I did.
It feels even more important now.
It's absolutely crucial.
We need reliable information to even begin to identify a creamy layer within the scheduled castes.
Right.
And to do it in a way that's fair and based on evidence.
Data collection would be paramount.
Okay, so what kind of data are we talking about here?
We'd need in-depth information on the social and economic situations of different scheduled caste groups.
Okay.
Broken down by things like geography, occupation, and even the specific types of discrimination they face.
It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It would be a big job.
And it's not just about getting the data.
Right.
It's also about how that data is collected and analyzed.
You've got it. That's a really important point.
We don't want to create a system that's biased or doesn't respect the cultural differences between communities.
Absolutely. The data collection process itself would need to be designed in a way that's ethical, culturally sensitive, and actually empowers the people involved.
So it's a collaborative process.
It has to be.
Okay, so let's imagine we have all this data.
Okay.
And we've managed to identify a creamy layer within the scheduled castes using a system that's nuanced and fair.
Yeah, okay, I'm following.
Then what? How do we choose between the preference model and the exclusive model?
That's where things get really tricky.
I can imagine.
It wouldn't be a simple choice at all.
No, I bet not.
It would depend on so many things. Like, what are we trying to achieve with this policy?
Okay.
How big is the difference between various scheduled caste groups?
Right. And what could the impact be on social cohesion?
So many layers to consider.
It's a complex issue.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are some of the key things to think about when choosing between those two models?
Well, let's start with the preference model.
Okay.
Remember, that's like setting aside a portion of the pie for a specific subgroup.
Right. Within the existing quota for scheduled castes.
Exactly. It's a more flexible approach.
Okay.
And it could be useful when you want to make sure lots of different disadvantaged groups are represented without completely leaving any of them out.
So if you have several scheduled caste groups who are all facing significant disadvantage, but maybe to different extents,
exactly,
the preference model could help make sure each group gets some level of support.
You got it. It's about creating a system that can respond to the different levels of disadvantage within the scheduled castes.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm guessing there are some downsides to this approach, too.
Of course. There are always trade-offs.
What are those? Well, some people argue that it might not do enough to really help the most marginalized groups.
Okay, I see what you mean.
If the piece of the pie reserved for a certain subgroup is too small, it might not really make a difference in their lives.
Right, it's about finding that balance.
It is a balancing act.
Between inclusivity and giving targeted support.
You got it.
What about the exclusive model? How does it approach these issues?
The exclusive model is much more targeted.
Okay.
It's like giving a whole separate piece of the pie to a specific subgroup. And this could be really beneficial in situations where a particular scheduled caste group is facing extreme disadvantage and needs a more focused intervention.
So if the data shows us that a certain group is constantly being left behind,
exactly,
this model could give them a dedicated path to get ahead.
That's the idea. It recognizes that sometimes treating everyone the same doesn't actually lead to fair outcomes.
So it's a way to level the playing field in those specific cases.
You could say that.
But I'm sure the exclusive model has its critics, too.
Oh, of course.
What are their concerns?
Well, one big worry is that it could create resentment and division between different scheduled caste groups.
Interesting.
If one group is seen as getting special treatment, it could cause tension and undermine the goal of social solidarity.
I'm starting to see why there's no easy answer here.
It's a really tough question.
Both models have their advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, Phil.
And choosing between them would require a deep understanding of the specific situation.
Absolutely.
And a careful consideration of all the possible consequences.
You're getting it.
It's about making informed decisions.
That's what it's all about.
This is already so complex.
We're just scratching the surface.
And we've only just begun to explore it.
There's a lot more to uncover.
It's clear that subclassification isn't a simple yes or no issue.
No, it's much more nuanced than that.
There's so much to think about.
So many factors at play.
From the historical context and legal precedents to the ethical questions about how we define and categorize people.
It's about recognizing the humanity of everyone involved.
Absolutely. And it seems like this creamy layer concept is going to be key to figuring this whole thing out.
It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
But before we get into that, I think we need a moment to digest everything we've learned so far.
That's a lot to take in.
It's clear that subclassification isn't just about ticking boxes and filling quotas.
No, it's much deeper than that.
It's about navigating these really complex social dynamics.
Right.
And ultimately making sure that justice is truly served.
Well said.
So join us in part 3 as we dig deeper into these complexities.
We'll unravel it all.
And explore how India might find its way through this delicate balancing act. Welcome back to the deep dive. I feel like we've been doing some serious mental gymnastics with this whole subclassification debate.
It is a lot to think about.
It's amazing how this one question about legal categories can turn into this huge discussion about social change and data ethics and even political power.
Oh, definitely. It's all connected.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It's like a web.
We're not just talking about rearranging boxes on a chart.
Right.
We're talking about people's lives.
Absolutely. Real people.
And their hopes for a more just and equal society.
It's about fairness, ultimately.
Exactly. And that leads us to some big picture questions.
Okay.
What does this whole debate about subclassification within the scheduled castes? What does it tell us about social justice in India today?
I think it's like holding up a mirror to Indian society.
Interesting.
On one hand, the fact that we're even having this debate shows how much progress we've made. We're asking these complex questions about equality, recognizing that disadvantage doesn't always fit into neat categories.
So it's a sign that things are moving in the right direction.
I think so.
But there are still challenges to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. There are always challenges.
What are some of those challenges?
Well, this debate also shows us where our current policies fall short. And the struggles we still have in tackling deep-rooted inequalities.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We're seeing how historical disadvantage overlaps with new forms of exclusion. And how even well-meaning policies can sometimes have unintended consequences.
It's like we're constantly learning and evolving.
You have to.
Our understanding of what equality means and how to actually achieve it.
It's an ongoing process.
We're realizing there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
And
that fighting for social justice means being constantly aware and adaptable.
You have to be paying attention and willing to adjust.
One thing that's really stood out to me throughout this deep dive is this tension between recognizing group identities and trying to create a society where those identities become less important.
I see what you mean.
It's like a paradox we're trying to navigate.
It's a tricky balance.
In the context of subclassification, this tension is really clear. We're trying to fix historical injustices that were based on caste.
Absolutely.
And to do that, we have to acknowledge those caste identities. And the inequalities they've created.
Yeah, you have to acknowledge the problem to fix it.
But by focusing so much on those identities, even for good reasons like affirmative action, aren't we in danger of making those categories even more rigid and permanent?
It's a valid concern.
It's a tough one for sure.
There's definitely a risk that by emphasizing subcategories within the scheduled castes, we could actually reinforce the very divisions we're trying to get rid of.
So it's a delicate balance.
It's a very delicate balance.
And it requires thinking about the long term.
You have to think ahead.
Not just about the immediate goals.
Absolutely.
So what does that long-term vision look like? What's the end goal?
Well, I think the ultimate goal is to build a society where your caste doesn't determine your chances in life.
Right.
Where people are judged on their merits and not their background.
That's a powerful vision.
It is.
But it's a long road to get there.
A very long road.
And we have to be realistic about the steps it will take.
One step at a time.
It's a journey, not a destination, right?
Exactly.
And it's a journey that requires us to constantly question our assumptions, adapt to new situations.
You're flexible.
And never give up on the fight for equality and justice.
Persistence is key.
Another thing that's been on my mind throughout this deep dive is the issue of social cohesion.
Right. How does all of this impact social cohesion?
Can we pursue policies like subclassification within the scheduled castes?
Right.
Without causing more division in society?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It feels like it.
Any policy that treats groups differently has the potential to create friction.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And when we're talking about something as sensitive as caste,
right,
those risks are even higher.
We've already seen how internal divisions and discrimination exist within the scheduled castes.
We have.
And any policy that creates new categories or hierarchies could make those tensions even worse.
It's a real danger.
So it's not just about creating the right policy.
No, it's not.
It's also about creating the right conditions for that policy to work.
Exactly.
In a way that brings people together.
Promotes harmony.
Instead of driving them apart.
It's about building bridges.
Exactly. It's about encouraging dialogue.
Yeah. Open community.
Building bridges between communities and focusing on shared goals instead of competition.
It's about collaboration, not competition.
We need to create a culture where everyone feels understood and valued.
Where everyone has a voice.
It all comes down to trust, doesn't it?
It really does.
For any policy to work, especially one as sensitive as subclassification, it needs the support of the people it's meant to help.
Absolutely.
And that trust has to be earned.
It can't be forced.
Through transparency.
Being open and honest.
Taking responsibility.
Genuine engagement with the communities involved.
Listening to the people.
So where do we go from here?
Good question. We've looked at the legal arguments.
You've covered a lot of ground.
Explored the creamy layer concept.
Broken it down.
And talk about the impact on social cohesion and trust.
It's complex.
What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing to remember is that there are no simple solutions when it comes to subclassification within the scheduled castes.
There are no easy answers.
It's a really complex issue with huge implications for social justice in India.
It's a big deal.
It really is.
And it's not just a question for lawyers and politicians to figure out.
No, it's not.
It's a question for all of us to think about.
We all have a role to play.
As citizens, as members of communities, and as people who care about building a fairer world.
A world where everyone has a chance.
It's about having those tough conversations.
Facing the hard questions.
Challenging our own biases.
Being open to new perspectives.
And working together to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to succeed.
Regardless of their background.
Well said. On that note, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
As we grapple with all these complexities, it's crucial to remember that we're not just dealing with abstract ideas or legal terms.
We're talking about people.
We're talking about real people's lives, their hopes, their dreams, and their fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect.
Everyone deserves respect and dignity.
So let's approach these challenges with empathy, with wisdom, and with a shared commitment to building a more inclusive and just society for everyone in India.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.